to run a common monetary policy. Imagine if Portugal is in a big recession while Germany is in a big boom. Does the ECB need to cut interest rates to deal with the recession in Portugal, or does it need to raise interest rates to deal with the overheating in Germany? That problem could be very important for a common monetary policy, which is why economists look a lot at this cyclical synchronization. Now, we're going to look in our paper at two aspects of this synchronization. One is the synchronization of the business cycle, that is to say economic growth. Are we growing or falling at the same time? But a newer concept that has begun to be studied in economics is the idea that the financial sector has its own cycles. They're linked to the business cycle, but they're not completely the same as the business cycle. That means times when credit booms and credit busts. And we're going to look at that too to see if those are lining up across Eurozone countries. Finally, there's the concept of structural convergence. And here I would argue that this is perhaps a misnomer. It's not the right term to use. Because ultimately what we want to see as economists in Europe is not that every country have the same economic structure. Having a diversity of economic structures is actually an advantage. But what you want to have is what our colleagues in the European Commission have begun to call resilience. You want to have an economic structure that can respond well when their economic shocks come, particularly if there are so-called asymmetric shocks. That is, you're shocked when somebody else in the Eurozone is not shocked. So we're looking at this concept of structural convergence or resilience, and I'll talk about that, but not in great detail later on. So what kind of convergence is desirable? What is it that we're looking for convergence? If you go back to the Maastricht Treaty or to the Delors report from the 1980s and look at what the founders of the euro envisaged, they envisaged a concept of multidimensional convergence. They wanted to see European countries converging on many of the dimensions that I just mentioned to you. Oops, sorry. In the beginning, from an economic theory point of view, the Eurozone was not considered to be an optimal currency area. It wasn't considered to be necessarily a perfect grouping of countries. But there was a strong belief that once you linked up together, the synchronization would come. As I mentioned, economic theorists were very interested in the optimal currency area from the point of view of cyclical synchronization. So when you have a common monetary policy, it responds appropriately to economic booms and busts. But there was also some concern that the adjustment mechanisms that would link the countries up were rather weak as well, and strengthening might be needed there. The Maastricht criteria, as those of you who've studied this know, focused on this issue of nominal convergence plus the issue of getting fiscal deficits down to reasonable levels, fiscal deficits and debts. And the idea here was that you needed to have similar levels of inflation if you're going to have the same central bank undertaking monetary policy in an inflation targeting framework. If you're targeting inflation and one country has very, very low inflation, one has very, very high inflation, that could be problematic. So in order to join the euro, convergence of this indicator, as well as on interest rates, had to already have occurred before joining the common currency. As I mentioned, financial cycles is a more recent issue that economists have begun to look at, and we'll talk about in a few minutes. So let me go back to this point that I made earlier about the fact that if you're going to have income convergence, you need to have productivity growth. And here you can see that, in fact, productivity growth has widely diverged over the last couple of decades. If you look here at starting with the year 2000, what you see, in fact, is that some countries have actually had a decline in productivity over the last 18 years. Other countries have had positive growth, and there's a wide range in between. Unfortunately, the average for the euro area 12 is in white, so you can't see it very well, but it's there. So you can see that there's been a wide range of productivity performance. Would it surprise you to say that given this wide divergence of productivity performance, we've also seen limited success in income convergence? Because obviously income convergence is going to come out of productivity behavior. This is a chart I showed this morning, actually. What we did is we divided the countries of the Eurozone, the original 12, into two buckets. The one is countries that had high productivity levels back in the 1990s, And the other one was the countries that had lower productivity levels in the 1990s. And then we look at what happened to them with their economic growth over the next decades. So the countries in the high initial productivity category are on the left. The ones on the low initial productivity are on the right. Which countries are on the right? Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And the other 7, we don't include Luxembourg because it's so small and it's an outlier, are on the left-hand side. Well, if we look at the left-hand side here, and we say what's happened to economic growth and the different components of economic growth, we see a couple of interesting factors here. One is that initially, in the 1990s, growth had all 3 main components to it. Productivity was growing, that's the green. Capital investment was generating growth, that's the sort of snowy area here. And the blue area, which represents the contribution of increases in the labor force to economic growth. So the labor force was growing, capital investment was increasing the capital stock, and we had productivity growth. And the result, of course, was relatively high economic growth. In the 2000s, before the crisis, we have a similar picture, but in this case, the contribution of labor has shrunk considerably. Why is that? Primarily, it's been demographic factors. Populations in Europe are aging, and the share of the labor force of working age is shrinking. And as a result, the contribution from labor is getting smaller. Now, let's look at the crisis and the post-crisis period. It's no surprise that economic growth has shrunk because we have a big recession in the middle of that data set. Mm-hmm. But it's also interesting to see what the composition of this is. We see a contribution of factor productivity, the green, but it's smaller. Notice how factor productivity has been shrinking in the successive decades. This is not just a European phenomenon. We see something similar when we look at the US. So there's a worldwide productivity challenge that's out there. But in addition, we see the level of capital investment also shrinking. It's positive, but it's shrinking. That's, of course, in part because of the recession when companies were investing less. And then finally, we see that the labor side of this turns negative. Why does it turn negative? Well, the demographic factors are getting more severe over time. Some countries already have shrinking populations. Several countries have shrinking working age populations. And in addition, in some countries, unemployment has gone up considerably and hasn't fully recovered, so the contribution from labor to growth is lower. Now, having looked at the left-hand side as kind of our baseline, let's turn to the right-hand side and see what happened to Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And here we see a similar picture, but much more severe, particularly recently. So we see a contribution of productivity growth, smaller but still there, more contribution from capital investment. That makes sense in the case of countries like Portugal, which have needs for capital investment and can grow from capital investment perhaps more readily than some of the more higher income countries. And then this contribution of the labor force, which is quite similar in the 1990s. Come to the boom periods, we see growth actually closer to what it was in the high productivity countries than it was in the other decades, but we see a shrinkage of the total factor productivity contribution. So it's capital investment and it's labor force growth that's driving the economic growth. And then we come to the crisis and post-crisis period. And what we see is negative contribution from the labor force, which is quite large. In this case, it's not just those demographic factors. It's the high unemployment in places like Spain that is, while shrinking, still much higher than it was before the crisis. It's also very weak capital investment, again, because of the deep crisis. And finally, negative contribution of factor productivity. That's going to be a real challenge for income convergence, which we're going to look at. You can see here in this chart, this is looking at the relative unit labor cost from different European countries. And this is a rough measure of competitiveness, how competitive one country is against another country. And what you can see here is benchmarking this at the year 2000, the labor costs for Germany have actually been shrinking over time. Why have the labor costs in Germany been shrinking over time? Because productivity is growing faster than wages. And that is generating a lower cost structure in Germany. If you look at Italy, which is the green one here, if I took out the wage increase component of this, you would see that wages in Italy have been growing almost at the same rate as wages in Germany. It's not that they're paying their workers too much in Italy, it's that productivity has been shrinking. And so the cost structure has actually been rising in Italy. So we see here that the cost structure has risen. We see a very similar phenomenon in Spain and Greece and Portugal, although Portugal is a bit less extreme than the case of Spain or Greece. And then the good news here is that with the reforms that have been implemented in the crisis, there has been a reversion of this deterioration in competitiveness. So the good news is that loss of competitiveness that happened, except in the case of Italy, has at least been partially reversed. We're almost back to the cost structure that we had back in 2000. Now, of course, we still have a gap vis-a-vis Germany because Germany's cost structure has continued to decline. But there's been a good reversion in the trend. The bad news here is that this cost structure adjustment has not come from productivity. It's come from lower wages, essentially. So while you have less cost, it's not coming in the way you would prefer. You would prefer it to be coming from greater productivity rather than from lowering of labor costs. So what does income convergence look like for the Eurozone countries? I'm going to show you two different measures of convergence that we use in the economic literature. One is called beta convergence. Beta convergence essentially says, let's take a baseline year, we'll measure the country's income level at that base year, and then countries that have lower income at the base year should have higher growth in the intervening period in order to have convergence. If I'm a poor country and I grow faster, then I'm converging. If I'm a rich country and I'm growing slower, I'm also allowing the poor countries to converge. So this is what this looks like. We're plotting the income level back in 1993 against the growth rate in the intervening years. So convergence of incomes should be reflected in this chart in a downward sloping curve. What do we see for the original 12 members of the euro? Well, there's a very, very tiny downward slope. And in fact, it's not statistically significant. So there's virtually no income convergence by this measure of beta convergence in the original 12 members of the Eurozone. Now, why has there not been convergence? Well, you can see countries like Portugal, Greece, and Spain are actually below this line. What that means is that they have not been contributing to convergence. They've not been converging over that period. On the other side, Ireland, of course, has been driving convergence because it's converged quite a lot. I'll say another thing which is not so positive. One of the contributors to this slight downward slope is, of course, Italy, which was a very wealthy country but has been growing so slow that it's actually been converging from the richer level down to the poorer level. That's not the kind of convergence we would like to see, obviously. Now, the better side of this story is when we include the new countries, the other 7 that have joined the Eurozone after its initial formation. When we include those countries here, we see actually quite strong convergence. Why? Because Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia have all been converging quite nicely. So, original 12 members of the Eurozone, not much convergence. When we add in the new countries, convergence does seem to be taking place because those new countries have been converging. Let me show you another indicator of convergence here. This is called sigma convergence. And the way we calculate this was we just take the coefficient of variation, sigma, for each individual year. How spread out are the countries each year? And then we can do a time series, seeing if you're converging, that sigma should be declining over time, right? Lower sigma means less spread from between the highest and the lowest countries, right? So that's what this line looks like. And what you can see in this line is that there's very strong convergence back in the 1960s. Then there's a period where it kind of stagnates until about 1970, 85. And then there's another episode of convergence, particularly in the run-up to the euro, where countries were deliberately undertaking policies to try to get ready for the euro. And then once the euro goes into effect, we see a period of stagnation, not much convergence, but not divergence either. And then in the crisis, we see very strong divergence. So this is partly a cyclical issue. There's strong divergence because some countries were hit much worse by the crisis than others. But there's also some structural components behind it, as you saw from the chart about productivity growth. Once again, when we include the other 7 members, the picture looks more positive. There's strong convergence in the early years of the euro. That's when those countries were joining, those ones who joined later. And then there's a period of stagnation, and there's a slight uptick in recent years. So that's the picture on income convergence. You can see this is the new countries that joined later, and you can see in most cases, there has been relatively strong convergence. The country that's a bit of an outlier there is Cyprus, where we haven't seen a whole lot of convergence. But in most of the others, you've seen some pretty strong convergence. Let me go to the nominal convergence area. The nominal convergence area, remember, the primary indicators that we're looking at here are interest rates and inflation. Are interest rates and inflation getting closer together, right? So this chart takes a look at the real interest rate. So it's the interest rate deflated by inflation. So it actually has both indicators marked in it together. But this shows something very interesting. Both interest rates and inflation rates converged before the euro even started. No surprise, that was one of the rules. In order to get in, you had to converge on those measures. But interestingly enough, interest rates converged even more than inflation. And that caused a very interesting phenomenon. This is all the interest rate spread with Germany in real terms. So on this chart, Germany is 0 the whole way through. And we're looking at how countries' interest rates in real terms diverged from Germany. And what we see here is that in the early years of the euro, the real interest rate in many countries was actually lower than the real interest rate in Germany. Why? Because the interest rates were almost identical and the inflation rate still hadn't completely converged. And that's why the real interest rate, if I am in Spain and my inflation rate is half a point higher than Germany, but my interest rate is the same, then my real interest rate is half a point lower than Germany. And that's exactly what happened. And this had the unfortunate side effect of fueling some consumption and real estate booms that later came back to bite some countries when the boom times were over. Now, what you see here is huge divergence. That's no surprise either. What happened? When investors began to realize that some countries had significant, significant sovereign debt challenges, they began asking for extremely high interest rates to finance them. And so the interest rates in these countries shot up. And of course, Portugal is the gray line here. You can see what happened in the case of Portugal. I didn't put Greece on here because then I would have had to have a different chart because it would be way up here on the ceiling somewhere.
We have another floor.
Yeah, it would have been in the next floor at least. But you can also see the good news is that once the crisis issues have been resolved, the spreads have come back down, and we've seen a resumption of nominal convergence, which is something good. Let's look now at the issue of business cycle convergence. And here, let me explain these charts to you. This is looking at something on the left-hand side that's called concordance. And the way to think of concordance is simply what percentage of the time are two different countries in the same part of the economic cycle. So what we've done is we've divided the economic cycle, and then we've measured what percentage of the time different countries are in the same part of that cycle, okay? And this number here is essentially on a scale of 0 to 1. So if this scale were at 1, it would say every country is in exactly the same part of the economic cycle at exactly the same time. And if it was 0, they were never in the same part of the cycle ever in that period of time. And what we see here is some very positive developments in terms of the degree of concordance. That is to say, the cyclical synchronization among Eurozone countries is getting higher. And that's good for Mario Draghi and his policymakers at the ECB, because they don't have to worry as much about countries being in very different parts of the economic cycle. So we start out with, in the 1970s up to the 1990s, with something slightly under 60% concordance, and we move up to something like 75% concordance in the most recent period. That's good news. But there's always bad news in the good news, it seems. Because on the right-hand side, we'll look at another measure of cyclical concordance, and that is, you may be in the same part of the cycle, but you may have a very different size to your cycle. I might be booming here, and you might be booming way up there. And that's still a problem for Mr. Draghi and his policymakers at the ECB. So we were looking here at the differential of growth rates. Are the cycles the same size? Not just are they happening at the same time. And here we see actually that the picture is very mixed. That in fact there was some convergence in the size of the cycles, but then recently there's been divergence in the size of the cycles. And here again, this is the crisis period. Obviously some countries had much deeper crisis than others, and that's reflecting this divergence in the amplitude of those business cycles. We also, as I mentioned earlier, looked at financial cycles. So we're looking at cycles of bank lending and how that's related to convergence. So we did the same measure of concordance for the financial cycle that we did for the business cycle. And we see something similar, but with one exception. So this is the concordance of all 12 of the euro area countries, the original ones. And you see there was a decline initially in the concordance, but now the concordance is actually quite high. It's, again, something like 75%. That means that banks are in the same part of their lending cycle, up with lending or down, at a similar time, 75% of the time, with one exception. And this is the interesting thing. We found that from comparing this period to this period, 11 countries became more synchronized. One country became less synchronized. But the one country happens to be a very important one, and that's Germany. Germany has actually become progressively less synchronized with the rest of the Eurozone in terms of its financial cycle, which could pose some policy challenges going forward. Let me illustrate this for you with just one chart. This is a chart of the financial cycle in Spain and the financial cycle in Germany. And what you can see here, first of all, the amplitudes are very different. Spain's financial cycle is much larger. But the other thing that you can see is they're not even in the same part of the cycle at the same period of time. Here, Germany's going through a dip, Spain's in a boom. Now Germany's up to a boom, Spain's in a dip. There's an issue there when the largest country in your currency union is increasingly out of sync in terms of its cycles with the other countries. So let me summarize for you the picture of convergence. I've done this on a little heat map here, and we're looking over here at the different types of convergence. And what we see is, as I mentioned, in the real sector, we had initially convergence. Then in the first decade of the euro, it was really stagnant. It wasn't converging, but it wasn't diverging. And then lately, we've seen divergence in income levels. On the nominal one, we had convergence in the beginning. Then in the first decade, we actually converged a little bit too much on interest rates compared to what we had on inflation, and that caused those real interest rates to become lower for some countries than for Germany, which caused some negative effects on the financial side. And then here we see a temporary divergence during the crisis of interest rates, which has since reversed. And again, sort of relatively similar performance on the inflation side. Turning to business cycle convergence, we see here that we start with sort of medium synchronicity, but we do get more converged over time. That's that concordance indicator that I showed you. But the amplitudes have actually diverged, which poses its own set of challenges for policymakers. And then finally, on financial cycles, we see high synchronicity initially on the financial cycle, but then a period of divergence and then convergence. And here we get convergence on the, we get convergence on the synchronization except for Germany, and we get some divergence recently on the amplitudes, which you saw in that chart of how Spain's cycles were getting more extreme than others. Let me talk now, having sort of summarized the view, on what Europe can do about these issues and how they've arisen. How can we foster convergence in the Eurozone? Well, let me start by saying what was expected. If we go back to the Delors report in the 1980s and say, how did they think this was going to work? They did expect it to work. How did they think it was going to work? Well, here's how they thought it was going to work. They thought that trade in goods and services would rise more quickly, and that would knit the countries better together, both in terms of synchronization, but also in terms of income levels. They thought that labor mobility would help. Workers would move from countries that were in bust periods to countries in boom periods, from poorer countries to richer countries. And when they went to work in richer countries, they would send remittances back, and they would raise the wages back home as well, and that would contribute to convergence. They thought that capital flows were going to be a huge driver of convergence. Richer countries were going to be investing in the poorer countries where there are great investment opportunities, and that was going to generate higher growth in the poorer countries, which would generate income convergence. And finally, there's a very clear statement in the Delors report that structural policy is going to remain with the national governments, but national governments will realize that once they lose their monetary policy tool, they're going to have to reform the structure in order to continue to compete. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that all national governments got that message, and that didn't happen to the degree that maybe it should have happened. And finally, of course, from a cyclical point of view, If you have counter-cyclical policy, that is to say, if you can spend more when times are bad and you save more when times are good, your amplitude of your amplitude of your business cycle is going to be less extreme. And you're also going to be able to synchronize better with other countries by using that active fiscal policy tool. That also didn't happen quite the way it had been intended to. Now, before I get into a critique saying what needs to be done, let me acknowledge that Europe did a lot of things during this last crisis to try to address some of these problems. In particular, the banking union is a huge step forward in helping to deal with divergence of financial cycles and business cycles. The macroeconomic balances in procedure, the 2-pack and the 6-pack, were designed to try to give some sort of moral pressure to tell countries, this is where you need to reform, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to adjust your fiscal, this is what you need to do on the structural side, to try to get countries to move in the right direction. And finally, the existence of the European Stability Mechanism has proven to be a backstop when times are really bad for countries that have had very deep crises, countries like Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Cyprus, and Greece. Having said that, there are some other things that can be done. What can be done? Well, in terms of business cycle convergence, if you want to be in the same part of the cycle and you want to have cycles that look more similar, if you have a fiscal mechanism, a common fiscal backstop, which we have proposed, that could help countries to smooth out their fiscal cycles, but also to help them synchronize better. If we were to reform the fiscal rules in Europe so that they were actually more counter-cyclical rather than pro-cyclical, which is what happened during the last crisis, that would also help. And finally, if countries undertake structural reforms to make their economies more flexible to respond when crises hit, then those crises won't have as deep an effect, and that will help your business cycle convergence. Turning to the financial cycle, well, here a key policy is going to have to be macro-prudential policy. What do we mean by macro-prudential policy? We mean ways in which central banks and regulatory authorities can lean against the wind when banks are getting a little bit too enthusiastic with their lending, but also can relax conditions when lending starts to slip so that you can kind of dampen the financial cycle. Because you have a common monetary policy cannot do that. It can't address an individual country's issues the way macro-prudential policy can do. The second recommendation we would have would be to complete the banking union. The two missing components of the banking union now are a backstop for the Single Resolution Fund and European-wide deposit insurance, both of which would help countries when they get into trouble and share the burden of dealing with banking sector problems across the union, and that would help synchronize and dampen economic cycles. Finally, we believe strongly that implementing a full capital markets union would also help. I made this point in the presentation I made this morning to the Bankers Association. But if you look at convergence in the US, one of the interesting things that you find, and I was surprised to find it, I didn't do this research myself, but when I read the research, it suggests that it's not so much fiscal policy in the US that cushions different parts of the economic cycle in different US states. It's actually the capital markets. Think about it this way. If a company goes bankrupt in California, who pays for that bankruptcy? Is it California banks only? Is it California bondholders only? No. Actually, you have a capital market that spreads that burden across the entire United States. There could be bondholders from that bond of the failed company in California in New York, in Florida, in Washington State. And that way, you're dispersing the shock across the area. Whereas in Europe, when a Belgian company goes bankrupt, it's primarily Belgian banks and the Belgian government that take the hit, so you don't have that ability to spread that across. If we had more developed capital markets across Europe, we could share that burden across Europe. So it's not just about banks, it's also about capital markets. In real convergence, which I think is ultimately what people care about the most, as I said at the very beginning, and I'm sure you're not surprised, it's ultimately about boosting productivity growth. If you want to converge, you've got to grow, and if you want to grow, you've got to generate productivity growth. How do we do that? Well, one way would be to look at growth-enhancing structural reforms. Those would be different in each country, but each country has a place where there's a structural bottleneck in its ability to grow. And if you can target those structural bottlenecks and alleviate them, you can also grow. We also are very strongly in favor of the idea of growth-friendly fiscal policy. And by this, I do not mean deficit spending. What I mean is the government should look at how it spends its money and orient its spending towards things like education, research and development, technology, those sorts of areas that can show infrastructure investment, that can show real effects in the growth impact as well. This is just an illustration. Don't pay much attention to the numbers. Just look at the general direction of the charts here. We did an exercise, our team in Washington did an exercise that said, what would happen if all the European countries in the Eurozone did a comprehensive set of structural reforms at the same time? What would happen? And we did some simulations, and that's why I say they're just simulations, so the numbers themselves don't mean a lot, but the general direction, I think, is correct, which is to say, in countries, in that set of low initial productivity countries, remember, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, there would be a very strong positive economic boost from those reforms. In the high productivity countries, it's smaller, but there's still a significant positive effect on those countries as well. The message here is, one, reforms do generate growth. Two, if you all reform together, it actually multiplies the positive effects across Europe. I grow faster because Spain is doing economic reforms. Spain grows faster because Portugal is doing economic reforms. And there's a combined sort of positive externality that takes place here. So that would be sort of a recommendation that we would have. Do the reforms, but do them in a concerted fashion. You'll even get more positive results from your efforts there. Let me finally, and this is my closing remarks here, talk a little bit about the political economy of this. If I were a pure economist and I didn't care about the real world, what I would say to you is you need cyclical convergence. That's the most important thing. But if you also have nominal convergence, that would be very important. But who cares about real income convergence? Panama has used the US dollar for over 50 years. They haven't converged to US income levels, and it doesn't seem to hurt anybody. So why does it matter if Portugal converges to German income levels or not? From a strictly economic theory point of view, that might be right. But we're not in a world of just strictly economic theory. People joined Europe for a reason, in part because they wanted their lives to get better. And if their lives don't get better, and they don't see the benefits of joining the monetary union and being in this endeavor, then maybe the support for this common monetary policy is going to deteriorate over time. So it's ultimately about making people's lives better, and that's why we care about income and convergence, not because of any economic theoretical concerns, I think. So thank you very much for your attention here, and I'd like to open it up now for any questions and comments you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It was a fantastic presentation. I think that most people should have some questions. I have more or less 8 questions for you.
8 questions, wow.
Anyway, probably I can choose some of them. Some of them are probably related to, but first, from the audience probably, and Manuel is trying to say something. You want the microphone, probably. Nada? Já.
So, Jeffrey, thank you very much for your very nice presentation. It was very, very clear, all the ideas. But I have sort of methodological point.
Okay.
You are not exactly trying to account for the divergence of countries in the context, for example, of a causal model, or, for example, in terms of identifying benchmarks to compare countries. Of course, you compare the Eurozone with the United States, with Japan, with UK, but you also compare the first 12 countries that joined the Euro with the remaining, but you are not comparing with the other countries from the European Union, for example. Or it could be very interesting to see what happened over the same period in the United States, which is not exactly the same institutional arrangement as the European Union. It's quite different. I would say that in a way you are arguing for the institutional organization of the financial markets in Europe becoming closer to the US situation, but it could be interesting to compare with the US what has happened over the same period. And also, we could try to put this in a more causal framework and to try to account. But I think that in that case, it could be better to have a model to account for TFP, for example, and to see what are the determinants of the evolution of the TFP. But my last point is whether there could be other forces behind the ones that you are blaming for this divergence in real terms. And what we have seen over the last few decades is that there has been an income concentration worldwide. And maybe these 4 Euro countries, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, they are very much on the side of the income groups who have been losing income in relative terms. And eventually the forces that have determined that income concentration are working within the euro area, and it's not so much an institutional problem of the euro area itself.
Yeah, that's a great question. Should I go ahead and take that now, or you want to ask several? However you want to do it.
Probably we're going to take some more questions, and then Jeffrey will reply to them all.
Well, thank you as well. I'm actually sad I didn't manage to convince all of my students to come to your talk today, because it's great because you talk about so many of the things we discussed with them in the practice session, so they have text to discuss many of these topics to do with convergence and structural reform. So some of them did come, some of them did come, so well done. So I just wanted to ask whether you could perhaps say elaborate a bit on when you were talking about the different patterns, essentially of lack of convergence, both of beta convergence and sigma convergence. You've mentioned, 2 main components relating to what was the cyclical component to it and the structural component to it. So I was interested in hearing a bit more about the structural component and contribution, given that, in Portugal, in particular, obviously I'd be more interested in Portugal. We know that this is supposed to have played a big role. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Ricardo Alves. Just a brief question. You mentioned the importance of structural reforms, and that if countries do a lot of structural reforms, that will be positive for economic growth. And in Portugal, it seems that at least since 2011, we have made a lot of structural reforms. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that economic growth is not coming. At least is not as high as we expect. And if you compare, for instance, Portugal with Spain, Spain is growing much faster. In the last 3 years, have grown by more than 3%, while we are still aiming to achieve a 3% economic growth rate. So I'm not so sure that these structural reforms have such a positive impact, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit about it. Thank you.
Well, I have
Should I take those 3, or you want to add one of your own? Okay.
One of mine. I'm starting from the end with your considerations on political economy and Panama. You've mentioned that Panama, they're using the same currency as the United States for 50 years, and no one expects Panama to converge to the United States. And that was a very thought-provoking idea. But then you mentioned, okay, but there is a belief, wanting in Europe of economic convergence. And I would put an even stronger point. In fact, I think in Portugal and probably in other southern European or southern peripheral countries, the euro is blamed for divergence. And this is a problem. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but the problem is there. However, it is also true, and you've shown us some data on that it is possible to converge within the euro. Then we have the case of the, I would call them the old periphery and the new periphery. And apparently the new peripheral countries are converging and the older ones are not converging. And so my question is, why is that? Do you have any opinion? What makes them so different or similar in terms of the new, inside the new group and inside the old group, that some characteristics that may be responsible for this type of behavior? Is it history? Is it geography? What is it? Yeah. That's one of, well,
that's a
couple of questions.
Question. Yeah. Okay, let me try to take the questions in order here of this first set. I very much take your point about the causality and the methodological issues here. I had one of my professors, when I was doing my PhD, said to me that every paper you write should have the seeds of the next paper in it, because there are questions that you weren't able to answer. And in fact, in this case, we've thought of exactly these issues, and we've already started another paper which is going to look at convergence in Europe at the regional level. So we're going sort of trying to go down from the national level to the regional level, and also trying to look at it in a causal context. So what we're doing is we're looking at different regions in Europe, and then looking at things like investment, education levels, to see if we can get some real causal factors in there on divergence. So I very much agree with your point, and I realize that this is not the strong point of this particular paper, but maybe in 6 to 9 months I can come back and present the next paper to you. We'll maybe have some of those answers. Okay. On the issue of the United States, I think you raise a very important point. There was actually just an article this last week by Paul Krugman talking about divergence among US states. And he makes the point that the US saw a lot of convergence. And in recent years, US states have actually begun to diverge as well. And he attributes this, and I think correctly attributes this, in part to the economies of scale of technological investment. What you seem to be seeing is that technological centers are growing much more quickly, and rural areas in particular are being left behind. And in the US, this means poor states like Mississippi and Alabama are actually starting to diverge again. Because even though they've picked up some manufacturing, which 15, 20 years ago left the north of the US and moved south for lower labor costs, now that's not keeping up with the kind of economic growth that's being generated by high tech. And I think there's a real issue there in the US as well. And you're absolutely right that this is part of the broader picture of income distributional issues more generally. I mean, I've thought about this, I fantasized about this one time. I was thinking about our paper and I said, well, we've done the countries, then we do the regions. Maybe we need to get down to the household level, in which case we're really talking about income distribution. I mean, it's a continuum, isn't it? And you're absolutely right. There are certainly some forces in the world economy today which are generating divergences of income distribution more generally. And that's part of the causal factors, I think, that you're alluding to here. I'm hoping that in our regional paper we'll start to highlight this. So, for example, you've seen here that Italy has not been converging in recent years. But if we get into our data analysis and we find that this is not a problem in Milan, this is a problem of Sicily, then there's a different answer to that question, right? It's not Italy per se, it's certain parts of Italy. And maybe the answer is more technologically related. It could also be in the US, the huge income dispersion is also partly related to tax policy. Tax policy has become much less progressive in the US, and economic and government spending has become less generous, and much of that spending was going to the poorer parts of the US, and the taxation was in the richer parts of the US. So that equilibrating factor of government policy has actually stopped working in the US. I would argue, personally, it's gone the opposite direction. It's actually contributing to divergence. So those are all very, very interesting points, very important points you make. On this issue of the different cyclical and structural components here. In the paper, we talk a little bit about, I put that one slide up that said, here's what people thought was going to happen. You were going to get convergence from trade, you were going to get it from capital investment, you were going to get it from all these other areas. In fact, none of those things actually delivered convergence in the way that we had anticipated. And let me just highlight one or two parts of that, which I think help answer your question. There was an expectation that investment would go from Northern European countries, wealthy Northern European countries, to less wealthy Southern European countries. What we found is that at the same time the euro was coming into existence, we had a bunch of former communist economies in the East that were emerging into capitalism. And they had very low cost structures. And what a lot of this foreign direct investment that the original founders of the euro thought was going to go south ended up going east. So there was a lot of investment into places like Spain and Portugal from the Northern European countries, but it tended to come in what we call hot money. It tended to come in financial flows that were financing consumption and real estate, and not financing plant, machinery, equipment, foreign direct investment, setting up factories, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of the reason I think we didn't see that kind of income convergence that we might have also seen. On the cyclical side, I would say, in my mind, one of the key missing features was to have fiscal rules that actually worked and generated counter-cyclical policy. If you go back and look at European fiscal policy, Euro area fiscal policy for the last 15 years, you'll find that on balance it was actually pro-cyclical. It was actually allowing countries to boom when spend more when times were good and spend less when times were bad, which is exactly what the opposite of you would want. Now, we can say that it's the fault of the rules, or we can say it's the fault of the countries for using the rules in an abusive way that didn't generate the right kind of policy. But whichever way you go, I think fiscal policy was one of those cyclical problems that could have been a solution but ended up being part of the problem. On the structural side, I mean, we could have a long talk about this maybe after the session here. But certainly the perception was that countries would realize that without their own monetary policy, their internal economy had to become more able to resist shocks and to move factors of production, capital and labor, quickly from areas that were booming to areas that were busting to areas that were booming, and that would help cushion the economic shocks. You had to be able to move labor, you had to be able to move capital, you had to be able to move managerial expertise, you had to have an efficient bankruptcy system to let that all happen, and those kinds of reforms didn't happen until the crisis hit. And this brings me to one of the other comments here about the structural reform issue. Our research in the IMF, and this is not my own personal research, but the research in the IMF suggests that structural reforms actually show better growth effects in good times than in bad times. But when do countries tend to do the structural reforms? In bad times. Why? Because they only do it when they're forced, when they really have their backs against the wall. So there is partly this, you might not see the results as much here because they were done in difficult times, and the results, take longer to manifest themselves if you do them in bad times. A second answer is, of course, the fact that it does take years. If you look at, say, the Hartz IV reforms in Germany, the reforms of the labor market in Germany. Germany, 20 years ago was the sick man of Europe, it was called. And they did these profound labor market reforms. It took about a decade before you actually saw Germany having one of the lowest unemployment rates and one of the most efficient labor markets. So I think that we need to make sure that we give enough time for these structural reforms to actually take place. This is not a quick solution like a quick fiscal or a quick monetary stimulus might be. These things take time, and I think that's perhaps one of the factors that you might be seeing here in Portugal as well. Now, the other possibility, and I don't know the answer, I'm not an expert on Portugal, the other possibility is, well, did you go far enough? Did you tackle the right areas? Did Spain do something different in the areas that it tackled, or the way it tackled those areas that helped generate that stronger economic growth in Spain than Portugal? I don't know the answer to that. I know a bit more about Spain than I do about Portugal because I used to work in Spain. But what I saw in Spain is they did a very serious job about tackling the banking system problems. They got those problems sort of not completely resolved, but they made very substantial advance, and credit growth began to become restored relatively quickly. They also did a profound set of reforms in the labor market. This was the second round in Spain. They did a round under Aznar, and then they did another round when the crisis hit. And together, it has made a much more flexible labor market. So those might be other areas. And again, I don't know where your structural bottlenecks are, but that's where I would look. I would look at, say, what did they do that we didn't do? What could we learn from the Spanish case to see if we could get that above 3% growth ourselves? Then on the issue of the political economy, I like the way you say that the euro is blind to convergence. I think you're absolutely right. Many people argue that the euro is causing the divergence. I do not agree with that. Our research does not show that. In fact, when we expanded our just very superficial analysis to the 28, what we found is that there's actually slightly more convergence among the 19 than among the 28. So it's not clear that being in the euro actually made things worse for convergence. But I think you are right that it doesn't necessarily help convergence either. Yes. In that respect, I think very, very clever turn of phrase there, that it's blind to convergence. This new periphery versus old periphery question, I think I maybe started to answer some of that, but in the fact that capital was moving east rather than south. When I look at some of the Eastern European countries as well, and by the way, I was the IMF mission chief in Romania during the crisis, so I have a lot of knowledge of some of the Eastern European countries and how they dealt with it. I see a couple of things, and this is not a criticism of the old periphery, it's just an observation. In all countries that had the deep crisis, very painful reforms were necessary. But in some of those Eastern European countries, they had seen worse. If you went to Latvia and you told the Latvians they had to cut their wages by 25%, which, by the way, they did, it was like, well, compared to the chaos after the fall of the Soviet Union, it wasn't so bad. And the income levels in Latvia had been growing by 10, 15% per year before the crisis. So giving a 25% cut in wages temporarily, for them it was like moving back 2 or 3 years. It wasn't like going back to the days right after the Soviet Union when everybody was on the verge of starvation. So maybe that sort of mentality allowed them to absorb those very serious shocks and then kind of rebound more quickly. This is just my own speculation, by the way. I think that might be part of it. And let's be honest, some of those countries are still lagging behind Portugal's level of economic progress. And when you're coming out of a communist system where everything works badly, it's actually relatively easy to generate high economic growth in the short run because you fix some things and growth starts. But once you get to a higher income level, keeping that growth going becomes progressively more difficult, right? When you're at the frontier of the production possibilities of the world, like say the US or Germany, it becomes hard to generate 4 or 5% economic growth because you've got to invent new things. It's not just adopting technology from somewhere else or getting investment from somewhere else. So that may be part of it. They're farther behind, so it was perhaps easier for them in that respect. But those are just speculations on my part. You want to take another round?
No,
or?
yes.
Okay.
I guess some people were shy before.
They're even more shy now.
Yes.
If not,
come on. If not, I have more.
Oh, here's one. Here's a brave one. Yeah, you have 8.
Yes,
I remember you have 8.
Some of them were already mentioned.
I'm Hugo. I'm just a student here. So.
There's nothing wrong with being a student. You don't have to say just a student.
Yeah, and I'm a student here.
That's the whole purpose of this place, right?
Fair enough. And I want to thank you. It was really good here. I would like to ask you, how could poor countries make the structural convergence given there's monetary and fiscal, limitations, right? They don't have a monetary authority and they have limitations on fiscal policy. So how could they achieve Germany's or Belgium's, France's, I don't know, level of structure production? And thank you.
Any others? I got another one over there.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, thank you. We have talked about the past of the convergence. What about the future? What will happen in the Europe when the ECB withdraws the stimulus? to allow countries to finance themselves?
You've briefly mentioned the need for counter-cyclical fiscal policy in Europe. And you've mentioned some kind of fiscal mechanism that would ensure that the counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Could you develop a bit more on that?
Sure.
Please?
We actually just published a paper on that just last week.
So give us the abstract,
okay.
please.
Very good, very good. On the issue of structural convergence, let me sort of reiterate a point that I made earlier at the beginning of the presentation, which is that we don't want you to converge to the same structure that Belgium has. As a resident of Belgium, I can tell you there are some areas in which they need some structural reforms as well. So the idea is not to imitate the structure of France or Belgium or Germany. The idea is to get a structure that that generates the greatest resilience and that generates the greatest capacity for productivity growth. I mean, that's the key. So if I were a policymaker in Portugal, the question I would be asking myself is, how can I modify the structure of my economy to free up innovation and production and efficiency process? Does that mean I need to reform the pharmacies or the notaries or the legal system or the bankruptcy law? I don't know the answer. Or is it the labor market? I don't know. But the issue is clear. That's what you need to look at. You need to look at where is your growth being held up. I've worked in many countries in my career, and I found that it's not always the same answer. So before I came back to working on Europe, I spent 3 years from 2012 to 2015 as the IMF's mission chief for Pakistan. And let me tell you, Pakistan's biggest limitation on economic growth was energy. Their energy market was a disaster, and they had 12 to 14 hours of blackouts a day. You can imagine what that does to industrial production. Every company, if they could afford it, had to put in their own power plant because they couldn't rely on the grid. Well, needless to say, when we did a reform program for Pakistan, where did we focus? The energy market was a huge problem. Now, I don't know Portugal, but I doubt that you have that type of a problem in Portugal. You have some other problems. And that's why it has to be a case-by-case basis, looking at where those structural bottlenecks are. In some countries, it's the energy sector. In others, it's maybe the education sector. In others, it's the labor market. In others, it's the product markets. And that would be why I would encourage you to sort of think about it in terms of what's holding us back as a country? Where are we not living up? And we mentioned this issue, somebody, I can't remember who, mentioned the issue of benchmarks before. One of the suggestions that we would have on structural side is that the European countries do a lot of benchmarking. That is to say, look at the labor markets of the other 18. See who's got the best. Or what can we learn? Benchmark yourselves against those countries that are performing better on the labor market. Benchmark yourselves against countries that are doing better on the product market, or on the capital market, or in the banking system, or in the education system. And that's going to be the way to sort of move yourself up in those sort of structural areas. The issue of the future of convergence is a very interesting one. I would say that one part of the divergence that we've seen in the last decade is certainly cyclical. And if we go back to my very, very first, I don't know if I can do that quickly here. If we can go back to my very, very first slide, all the way back. There we are. What you can see here is that Portugal actually converged last year because the euro area growth rate was 2.3 and Portugal's growth rate was 2.7. That's convergence. So some of that is going to happen automatically because we're getting out of the crisis. There's that cyclical component that I think will be better. So Portugal and Spain have started converging again. But in order to sustain that over time, and this was the point of my presentation, you've got to do that productivity thing. You've got to figure out the ways to get that productivity growth. And how do you do that? It's research and development, it's innovation, it's structural reform, it's education, it's investing in better infrastructure, all of those things that help generate productivity going forward. So I really do like your phrase about the euro being blind to convergence. There's nothing in the euro, I don't think, that's going to guarantee that this is going to happen. And that's why you need to make have policies that will make this happen. On the issue of counter-cyclical fiscal policy, my boss, Christine Lagarde, just gave a speech, was this last week, no, Sylvia? Last week in Berlin, where she launched a new, what's called a staff discussion paper. You can find it on our website, imf.org. And it proposes a common fiscal policy for Europe. And let me tell you how our proposal would work. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, but this is our idea. If all the countries in the Eurozone contributed 0.35% of GDP per year into a common fund, and that money is all pooled together and builds up when good years. And then when times are bad, automatically, and this is key, automatically when your unemployment rate in your country goes above its long-term average, you would begin to draw automatically on that money. So in other words, you would begin to receive checks from Brussels when your unemployment rate got above its, pardon? Well, maybe from Luxembourg if they put it in the ESM, who knows. But you would begin to get checks back. It's your own money coming back to you. But you could also take money that was being contributed by other countries if they're still in a boom state and you're not. So you would have that ability. But over the cycle, it would be calibrated so that there would be no permanent transfers. Now, for poor countries like Portugal, maybe permanent transfers would be a good deal, but other countries would be very resistant. So we designed it so that over the cycle, every country would balance out. And this fund would have the ability in exceptional cases to borrow as well. So to sustain that. And what we show in our staff discussion paper is that this size of common fiscal capacity, 0.35 of GDP per year, could actually cut the size of a major recession in half. So it wouldn't solve all the fiscal problem, but it would solve half the problem. And then national policies could deal with the rest. And that would make a huge difference, in my opinion, on the cyclical convergence amplitude issue that we were talking about before. So if you want to read more, staff discussion note that was just published by the IMF, go on imf.org.
Thank you very much. Well, probably we may finish now this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you to all. All this is recorded, so we may tell our friends to, to have a look at this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We were not many, but it was quite...
No, it was a very interesting discussion.
I